how in 2015 the then Prime Minister, Mr. Yatsenyuk, declared that in Donbas, non-humans live in Donbas, inhumans. And the current president, Mr. Zelensky, did not go very far from that, who, in an interview last September, when he was asked what he thought about the people who live in Donbas, he said, well, there are people and sometimes there are species. They're species, they're beings. This seems to be a very common reference of the Ukrainian authorities. They declared all those who don't agree there as terrorists, and for 8 years the Kiev regime has been conducting a military operation against the peaceful civilians. And by the way, in Ukraine for many years now, total mobilization of all adult population, including women, is being conducted in order to recruit them into the ranks of nationalist battalions and the armed forces. Now, by cynically declaring its commitment to the Minsk agreements, the Kiev's authorities overtly sabotaged their implementation. There was financial transport blockade of Donbas. People were denied their pensions, their subsidies, their access to education. They were denied their basic civil rights, including those that were guaranteed by the international pacts of 1966. So then Mr. Zelensky, having been tired of pretending, stated that it was impossible to implement the Minsk agreement. In fact, Mr. Poroshenko, just a couple months ago, proudly stated that the Minsk agreements, which he signed, neither him nor no one else in the Ukraine had any intention of implementing these, that these agreements were simply needed to win time in order to obtain weapons from the West for the war against Russia. And the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Mr. Danilov, said something very similar. Of course, the Kiev regime owes its impunity to its Western sponsors, first of all Germany and France, but also the United States. Instead of pushing the Kiev authorities to implement the Minsk agreement, Berlin and Paris and Washington cynically ignored the growing threats of Kiev to resolve the problem of Donbas by force, the so-called Plan B. Over the past few years, the Kiev regime has conducted a frontal assault on the Russian language. It brazenly trampled on the rights of Russian and Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. The scandalous language laws were enacted on education in 2016, on ensuring the role of Ukrainian language as a state language in 2019, on the comprehensive general secondary education in 2020, on native peoples of Ukraine in 2021. All these laws are aimed at ousting the Russian language. In essence, it's complete ban. At the same time, laws were adopted that promoted the theory and practice of Nazism. The timid recommendations of the Venetian Commission of the Council of Europe and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the OSCE High Commissioner on Minorities, on amending the language legislation were simply ignored by Kiev. And these multilateral structures at the same time didn't find the courage, or they were not allowed, to convince the Kiev authorities to fulfill their obligations they undertook in the area of human rights. The Ministry of Education of Ukraine has excluded Russian and Russian literature from the school curriculum. Books are being destroyed just as in Nazi Germany. And ethnic Russians are being subject to intolerance. And today the officials from Ukraine have no longer even tried to hide their anti-Russian feelings, calling on the killing of Russians. Just a few examples. Mr. Vrublevsky, the Ukrainian ambassador to Kazakhstan, who's now in Kiev, just a month ago declared in an interview, and I quote, "We're trying to kill Russians, as many Russians as possible. The more we kill today, the fewer our children will need to kill." End of quote. Did anyone notice this quote? Just earlier this April, the mayor of Dnipro, Filatov, said something similar. The time of cold-blooded fury has come. Now we have a full moral right to calmly and with a clear mind to kill these non-humans around the world for as long as possible and as many as possible. End of quote. On the 13th of September of this year, just recently, Mr. Danilov stated, and I quote, in towns where the Ukrainian armed forces enter, people will undergo Ukrainization without taking into account their views. This will apply not only to Russians, but representatives of other nationalities. And if you want to study any other language, such as Romanian, Polish, Ivrit, please go ahead, but not to be financed by our state. You can do it at your own expense. You can improve your educational level at your own expense. End of quote. Is there any need to say that all these Russophobic statements have remained unpunished? And we're not even talking about Russophobia here. This individual spoke about representatives of other ethnic groups that live in Ukraine. And of course, the ultimate was the interview with Mr. Zelensky on the 5th of August, who suggested to everyone who feels that they're Russian for the good of their children and grandchildren to get the hell out and to go to Russia. And I think the decisions that have been adopted by a whole range of regions of Ukraine about conducting referendums are the result of his advice. And under the guise of combating Russian aggression and separatism, Ukraine is strengthening its persecution of dissidents. In March, a ban on the activity of 11 political parties under the pretext of their links to Russia. Opposition Russian-language television channels have been closed for any attempt to provide an alternative view to the official view. Journalists are persecuted. Madame Berezhnaya, a well-known public official who has often spoken at the UN and the OBSE, is in the prison of the security services. We have no doubt that Ukraine has become a completely totalitarian Nazi-like state where the norms of international humanitarian law are trampled on. There's no surprise that the armed forces and the national battalions are using the tactic of terrorists, using peaceful civilians as human shield. And here, what's particularly cynical is the position of states that are pumping Ukraine full of weapons and training their soldiers. The goal is obvious. They're clearly stating it, to drag out the fighting as long as possible, in spite of the victims and destruction, in order to wear down and weaken Russia. That policy means the direct involvement of the West in the conflict and makes them a party to the conflict. Intentional fomenting of this conflict by the collective West remains unpunished. Of course, you won't punish yourselves, sir. We have no illusions that today the armed forces of Russia and the militias of Lugansk and Donetsk are being opposed not only by the neo-Nazi formations of the Kiev regime, but the military machine of the collective West. And in real time, the regime of real time, using modern systems of weapons, ships, satellites, drones, NATO is providing intelligence to the Ukrainian armed forces and stating that, convincing them that Russia should be defeated on the field of battle. Official representatives of the European Union have stated this, and Russia should be punished by having any sovereignty stripped from it. This isn't even latent racism, but overt racism. Against the backdrop of mass shelling of towns and cities of Donbass, Mr. Zelensky is overjoyed at the effectiveness of Western weapons. Here's a quote. "At last we feel how powerfully Western artillery has begun to operate. The weapons that we've received from our Western partners, its accuracy is exactly what we need," he cynically stated. At the same time, there were no military or strategic targets located in the towns that were shelled. Only peaceful citizens of Donbass are suffering. Since the end of July, the armed forces are lobbing mortar rounds to the center of Donetsk and its environs that are banned. They're lobbing banned anti-personnel rounds called lobe or blade.